Hello and welcome back to the Innovate Eco podcast. I'm your host, Rob Brigglesworth, and in today's episode, I'm bringing you a author turned ecopreneur in this interview, Benedict Macdonald. Now, Benedict has written some of the most popular natural history books in the UK and beyond of recent times. His books, Rebirding, Cornerstones, and others, have been telling a story, painting a picture of what nature restoration in the UK and beyond could look like and how landscapes should look, why and how they've changed, and how we can possibly return them. And he's built upon that background and those books, and working at the likes of the BBC and in director roles of the BBC and things like that as well, to build his business, Restore. Now, Restore are looking to partner with farmers and other landowners, stuff like that. So we get into that in a lot of detail in this episode. We talk about how we ended up in this mess in this country, why financing nature is still a challenge, and how Restore are planning to do that and what their mission and vision is. So hopefully you'll find this episode useful. We get into ecopreneurship and the entrepreneurial journey as well later on in the episode, which is, of course, the whole point of this podcast and channel. If you're watching this on YouTube, hello, we're on YouTube now, the video is here, so yeah, please do subscribe to the channel if you're new here, or if you listened to the podcast before and you're on YouTube, then please do, and I'll be back at the end after this conversation with Benedict for some closing remarks. But without further ado, please enjoy this interview with Benedict Macdonald. So Benedict, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on.
No, lovely to be here, Bob.
So I always like to start with a bit of an origin story, and particularly for people that work in nature, where I like to begin is with an early nature experience or story that you might have that really sparked your interest in this field and started you on this journey. I know that pretty much everyone I speak to who works in nature has something kind of early on in their childhood or in their younger life where they can point to and say that was where this journey began. So do you have one of those stories?
Well, I think the nature journey began when I was about 4 years old, and I used to go to rainy days. My my family would despair of always going for walks in the rain when we used to go on our holidays down to Pembrokeshire in Wales. So we used to go to this butterfly house, and of course, when you walk in, it's humid and it's warm, and whatever the weather's doing outside, and these extraordinary owl butterflies and morpho butterflies. And of course, you know, when you're small, you gravitate towards things that are sort of, what's the word, flashy and exciting and romantic. And you don't necessarily have the patience to be staking out a rare wader in a bird hide. I think that was a later iteration of my life. But I was completely captivated by butterflies, and still am to this day, such that we're actually thinking of breeding some lost butterflies at Restore. But that sort of love of things that could fly really took off from a very early age. And then soon after, I kind of developed my passion for birds. My father was a keen bird watcher. I vividly remember the first particular bird I really wanted to see was the chough, because it just captured my imagination. You know, it's this kind of souped up crow.
It's a great name as well. I love the name.
I always think, I've always thought of choughs as if you took your local crow to a stylist, it would come out looking like a chough, you know, wonderful, sleek. So I've always had a love of nature. I mean, as long as I've had a love of anything, really. But I think when I was 14, I decided I wanted to combine the two things I most enjoyed, which is creativity and nature, into a job. And I sort of wanted to be one of the David Attenborough television producers, which eventually came true many years later. But I think, it was only really in my mid-20s I began to develop the sense that nature itself was really falling apart at the seams, particularly here in the UK. And obviously, the more I travelled overseas, the more it became apparent that Britain is, extremely depauperate in its sort of excuse me, take two.
No worries.
So the more I traveled, the more it became obvious then, coming back to the UK, coming from, holidays in France, clouds of butterflies in meadows, redback shrikes, turtle doves, all these things appear to be quite common in some of these places. And then coming back to the UK, where you had to really struggle to find them. And I suppose that then, percolated slowly over many years in terms of realizing that Britain is not in a not in a good place, which is a horrible feeling when your main hobby is nature, to realise the nature on your own island is doing considerably worse than it is even in most parts of mainland Europe. So that was
Mm.
that was a much later realization, though.
Yeah, I've heard it described before as when you start to learn about nature, you go from seeing things in a kind of 2D landscape to it becomes more 3D. You start to notice things that you didn't notice before, and before it was maybe to the untrained eye might be a green blur of nature, this word. You start to realize, there's much more going on. You start to see the seasons more and things like that. And the tragedy is, as you say, when you're in the UK, then you start to realize what's not there and what's missing. And yeah, I certainly had a similar feeling as I began to train as an ecologist and start to realize that stuff's not quite how it should be, and you start to realize how blind I'd been before, perhaps. So, I mean, on that point, just before we get into Restore and talking about the business you're working on now, I just wanted to provide a bit of context for the listeners around just how we got into this mess, I guess you could call it, in the UK. And I think you mentioned there it's that traveling abroad that really brought it home to you. And I know in your book Rebirding, I've got a line that I picked out when I read it that I highlighted, which is countries like Belarus and Romania may be fascinating reminders of our past, but they don't provide a viable model for our future, which I thought was an interesting one. So yeah, using that kind of that as a basis, what do you mean in terms of those countries providing a lens for what the UK used to look like, and how did we get into the kind of mess that we're in now?
Well, Britain's been de-wilding for thousands of years was my main realization when I started writing Rebirding. I was very much going to be a book about the collapse of the invertebrate food chain,
Mm,
a much more limited book, although I do still believe that is the absolute staggering difference between large parts of Eastern and parts of Southern Europe and Spain and Britain is the complete paucity of insect abundance, which basically then collapses the food chain upwards in terms of your cuckoos, your lesser spotted woodpeckers, your spotted flycatchers, and so on. But I began to realize that we were talking a lot to the ornithological community about decline since 1970. And it's only because there was a bird atlas in 1970 that people,
yeah.
1970s, if somehow magically before 1970, then all these tree sparrows and everything was wonderful. And of course, it's complete nonsense. We've been de-wilding for thousands of years, particularly, in the last 250 years, we've simplified the countryside. Enclosure of the countryside was a huge change from having these endless kind of heterogeneous habitats, so infinitely varied habitats, intermingle habitats, orchards, wood pasture, to simplified landscapes with hedgerows, edges, fields. Fields obviously then became bigger and bigger over time. So, across the Victorian period, we managed to drain, probably about 90% of our red shanks and our lapwings. So we were really only left with the dregs by the early 20th century. So this realization that underpinned, the writing of Rebirding, which I researched over 4 years. Excuse me.
It's
This
okay. Yeah.
realization, which underpinned Rebirding, which I wrote over 4 years, was that Britain always started first when it came to nature removal. Whether we take the brown bears, whether we take the wolf, whether we take the complete eradication of the white-tailed eagle down to the last bird, the systematic extirpation of the Scottish wildcat, or it shouldn't be called the Scottish wildcat, of the wildcat that was then driven into Scotland.
Mhm.
We've just become, extremely good over the centuries at wildlife removal. It's become a bit of a speciality of ours in a way that happened to a much lesser degree in other countries. I mean, I always find it interesting that in 1918, I believe we shot out our last white-tailed eagle. In 1922, the Polish government enacted a protection statute on the white-tailed eagle. There are now over 1,000 pairs of white-tailed eagle in Poland in all sorts of different habitats. Fortunately, thanks to the work of people like Roy Dennis, we've recovered to 100 pairs of white-tailed eagle plus here in the UK, which is incredible. But they've had to be brought back, rewilded, because they were taken away completely. So I think there's a cultural element to this. Of course,
Mm.
we have a busy island. We particularly after the Second World War, there were a whole range of subsidies, all about extraction, old orchards, mixed farms, just, wiped in favor of simplified crops, ever bigger fields, the removal of scrub. And of course, then the most recent wave of dewilding has been chemical dewilding. So glyphosate, other herbicides, fungicides, pesticides, although pesticides are used less these days. But these things have hit the ecosystem again and again and again and again and again. The drainage has been, almost total in the British landscape in a way that it hasn't been in some other countries. And the cultural tolerance of even house martins these days. I was staying at what looked like a nice hotel, and I was about to check in when I realized that they basically put mesh up over all their house martin nests. So they basically eradicated this whole population that won't probably now be able to find anywhere else to nest, having come all the way from Africa. I just thought this is absolutely pathetic because it's completely pointless. It doesn't have any impact on food production. It doesn't have any impact on anyone having these amazing little animals living beside us. So sadly, I think we are very good at creating order and cleansing as a country, and we've been doing this for quite a long time. So anyway, that's all a bit depressing. But I think we got into, we some of the reasons were entirely valid. If you're switching from a hunter-gatherer community to settling down and growing crops and keeping sheep, then obviously, a brown bear or a wolf is a major problem. So you get rid of it. What's interesting in our history is we also got rid of birds for really bizarre reasons. So we got rid of the choughs because they were seen as a symbol of Cornish resistance. We got rid of, most of our wildcats were killed from the time of Henry VIII onwards under some amazing bit of legislation called the Tudor Grain Act, which was for the protection of grain. But of course, wildcats eat rodents which eat grain and would have been an amazing asset to a farm if anyone had understood ecosystem services back, 100 years ago. So we've cleansed to the very edge, which now means that in Britain, most of the work we do can't be conservation because there is so little left to conserve. The New Forest, the Caledonian Forest, the wonderful flow country, of course, amazing seabird cities, but the vast majority of the countryside is now ecologically silent. So really what we need to be doing is looking at restoring big areas of the British countryside. And that is a daunting challenge because it is much harder to bring back life when most life has gone than it is to conserve what's already there. Which I think we've got, these brilliant postage stamp RSPB reserves, which are very good at holding on to what's, in some cases, bittern, marsh harrier, roseate tern, what's already there. But the restoration process is only really just beginning.
Agreed. And I'll come on in a minute to the kind of changing business case, I guess, for restoration, because that's something that you're working on and something that I'm also working on and really excited about. But that point you made there around the shifting baseline we've had in this, and the reality that most people that live in the UK have never seen what a wilded UK would look like or could look like. So that's what I thought you did really well in Rebirding and in your books is using these other countries almost as proxies for us to be able to imagine what it could look like, I guess. So what do you see as the main challenges in the UK that we do you believe we can get back to a truly wild state with apex predators and things like that, or do you think it's always going to be a bit more of a hodgepodge of solutions, and which countries maybe are the best proxies still out there for what we should be aiming to achieve, I guess?
I think it depends where you are, and I think it depends on population density, amongst many other factors, including roads, obviously cultural factors as well. But I spent last January in Estonia tracking lynx and was very fortunate to actually see a Eurasian lynx on several occasions, which I never thought would be possible. And it was fascinating that these lynx were hunting in working landscapes. They were hunting in forestry, clear fells. One of them was even coming into a school playground and nailing hares, and the kids would watch it out of the window. Right. Some would sit on hay bales, and our lynx guide would take his boy on driving lessons, and they drive through this field, and sometimes they drive through this field, and there would just be a lynx sat on a hay bale, just sunning itself. And I'm a lynx, deal with it. And it just became quite obvious to me that these animals, particularly lynx, I think wolf is probably quite a different proposition, but species like the lynx, if put into the Cairngorms National Park, if put into Galloway Forest, if put into Kielder, with proper consultation and respect for farmers and, telling farmers the truth, very rarely, but occasionally, a lynx will eat a sheep. There's no point pretending they never do. They very rarely do. They're much more at home in woodlands hunting roe deer. That's their evolutionary pathway, if you like. I think living with an animal like that in areas of northern England and Scotland with a low road network, low disturbance, areas where the animals can be left in peace, as much as the humans, is eminently possible within the next 20 years. Yes. I think I always slightly shudder at the phrase apex predators because it involves three entirely different animals. One is a cat that is extremely secretive, the size of an Alsatian. It just vanishes into the woodland. And most people, who've tried to see a lynx have never been able to see a lynx. They're really difficult to see. And I think they'd probably be wandering around with radio collars on. So I don't think it would be a pristine Holocene wilderness. We won't have that in this country. Wolves, of course, evoke so much more emotion. We went to enormous efforts to get rid of them. And I think while you have, the extent of sheep farming we have in the UK at the moment, wolves would be a very difficult sell. These small crofting communities on the edge, people always talk about putting wolves in the Scottish Highlands. There are still villages and communities there. Sadly, many were shockingly cleared in times past. But I think it would be seen as a very aggressive move unless local communities really wanted there to be wolves. So I think the wolf and the lynx are very different. And then, of course, the third apex predator is the brown. Then the third apex predator, of course, is the brown bear, which is an entirely different proposal. This is an animal that can swipe your head off, that often, won't always run away from you when you bump into one in a wood in Romania, for example. And it's an entirely different proposal. Bears can not only kill sheep, but they can kill cattle. So, do I feasibly think that short of theoretically one large island in the Hebrides or move somewhere else, I don't know, say for the sake of argument, all the people of Jura decide they want to go and live on Isla, and we're left with an uninhabited island of scale that we could have some sort of electric fence around. I don't really see us having bears back in the UK now. I think that will be they are best left in those Carpathian landscapes where they have hundreds of square miles of forest to avoid us for their safety and for our safety as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be different, but it can only be better than what we've got now, and it's going to take a lot of collaboration and clever thinking and mindset changes. And obviously, this is what you're hoping to bring together and what you're working on with Restore now. So I wanted to dig into that a bit more and how that journey to founding your business this year, I believe it was when you launched, and why now things have changed enough, I guess, for there to be an opportunity to create a business in the private sector, because the NGOs, the charities have been that's where conservation has lived in most people's minds in the past. And to me, it's fascinating that we're seeing businesses now evolve in this space. So yeah, what's changed and what's the vision you're trying to realize, I guess, with what you're working on at Restore?
Well, I think it goes back to when I was writing Rebirding. I realised that if we are going to transform, grouse moors, shooting estates, upland, sheep farming in Wales, the economy has to be the driver. Because nobody wants to be sitting at home with their family going, do you know what, we're going to do the right thing for nature by bankrupting our farm or by not making the, £200,000 revenue we've just made from, shooting on the hills this year. Nobody really does that. You might get the odd philanthropist, you might get the odd billionaire like Anders Hospoulsen doing amazing things in Scotland, but you're not going to have a replicable model until you tackle the economy. So I sort of knew that as a generality when I was writing Rebirding. And I think, at the time I was in a pretty, I would say cushy, pretty successful career in wildlife television. I was for Disney. I was, charting the journey of the swallow from one end of the world to the other, which is a film I'd wanted to make since I was 14 years old. And I was presented an opportunity to move completely out of television into rewilding at a company called Real Wild Estates. And I just felt that it was the right time. I just felt that it was the right time to move because I could see that markets at that time there was more talk around the carbon market, of which I've got some reservations, but there was a clear move of the economy behind nature restoration, both at private sector biodiversity credits, carbon credits, but talk of biodiversity net gain at that time. This was in early 2021. But also this shift towards public money for public goods at the same time. So this sort of private-public pincer movement of green finance, and a lot of spotlight on how economically bankrupt a lot of these existing land use models are, whether that's upland sheep farming, whether that's grouse shooting, and hopefully rebirding played a little role in poking some of the holes in the myths that these things make a lot of money and that nature is the thing that is an optional nicety that doesn't make money. Of course, the alternative is true, or the opposite is true. So it seemed a good a time as any to jump out of TV, and I guess I thought I'd had a pretty good run. I'd worked on the Our Planet series. I'd been able to make these amazing films, and of course, in doing so, to see all these parts of the world that were sort of living in my brain and relevant examples that I could bring to UK nature restoration. So I just made the jump and had to go and speak to Martha Holmes, my producer, and say, look, I'm really sorry you've given me this amazing opportunity to produce a film about bird migration, which I've wanted to do since I was 14, but having written Rebirding, the number of landowners and farmers who wrote to me and got in touch was beyond anything I really imagined. There is without sounding massively pretentious, there is a kind of calling here to do something that's much more UK nature recovery focused. I don't have all the skills by any means. I've got some of the skills to do it. So I made the jump out of TV and have never looked back. And then Restore, I think, developed from feeling that I guess I wanted a business that was primarily driven by nature restoration, and then vectored in really, really good finance to make it very attractive, not necessarily the other way around.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to create a non-corporate but highly viable nature restoration business where we become known as the primary provider of nature restoration for other people's land. I'll come on to the owning v non-owning land thing. And that was what led to the formation of Restore. And I wanted it to be a kind of triumvirate, I guess, of three types of talent: sort of land management and ecology, vision, which I guess is kind of the thing that falls to me. It's what should be there, what could the landscape look like. That's the thing I think that differentiates our approach. We don't go in and modify a hedgerow. We don't go in and tweak. We basically come up with blueprints for landowners to totally start again, transform the landscape. And then, of course, the third critical element is all elements of capital, from utilizing countryside stewardship, often still a bit the sort of unsexy government version of private funding, but still extremely useful for landowners, what I call boring and safe. And then layering an approach of biodiversity net gain, of nutrient neutrality when needed, of carbon credits, of biodiversity credits, to create landowners really compelling financial packages that have to make them considerably more well off than before working with Restore. Otherwise, we just wouldn't have a business. And that was the team I assembled on that basis.
Fantastic. I mean, yeah, like you say, it has to be financially viable to make it work. But also, as you mentioned, there are lots of myths around current land uses and how they're making lots of money when actually the reality is that a lot of land uses maybe aren't the best use of public money necessarily, and actually having a rethink about where we distribute capital and what we use certain bits of land for, I think is very much needed. I mean, what are you must come up against still some of the perhaps tired in some cases, but perhaps also well-founded criticisms of of rewilding still kind of when you're talking to landowners and when they're talking about food production and how you balance it, like to people who are, that's one of the kind of things that comes out from people who are unaware of how everything might fit together. What would your kind of, I guess, best explanation be to those people who are new to this space of how you see it being balanced alongside still producing food for the nation that we need?
Well, I think it's the great false dichotomy. I refer to it as food wash.
Yes.
We have lots of greenwash going on, people pretending that, cypress spruce trees are great for nature. And we also have a lot of food wash from the NFU, particularly,
Yeah.
pretending that there's any, and there really is almost no dichotomy. I'll just break down that rather bold statement. So firstly, by my calculation, 16% of the UK land mass is deer estate, predominantly in Scotland, almost all in Scotland, in fact, and grouse moor in Scotland and Northern England, predominantly. That's 16% that is ostensibly not producing food. You might have some sheep there being used as tick mops, a tiny amount of venison, and, I don't know, some totally inconsequential number of grouse. You don't hear, parents worrying they can't feed grouse to their children. So I'm assuming that these are not, food producing landscapes. So you've got 16% that could be fully rewilded, and I use the word advisedly, the full ecosystem restoration with zero impact on food production. Well, that's a pretty good starting place, I've always thought. In addition, though, I think a lot of people have rightly begun to unpick this kind of myth that food is this sort of magical collective. It's not. I mean, there's food that's good for you. There's food that's actively bad for you. Simplified cereals. When we drive through Wiltshire, we see these waving fields of corn and barley that have been glyphosated. I don't want that stuff going into me. It goes into white bread. It goes into pasta. It goes into biscuits, all the things that make us fat and contribute to the decline of our gut microbiome. So what we should really be asking is, what is the food that we actually should be eating if we want to live a long and healthy life? And of course, we know the answers to this already. Or get in unsprayed vegetables, fruits, nuts, sustainably sourced fish. I realize that's probably a statement that we could spend an hour talking about whether there is something. And in my view, as a non-vegan, sustainably sourced outdoor bred, zero input beef, lamb, absolutely, and pork. Pigs are a much missed part of the UK landscape in all sorts of different ways. So that's the prism I look at it from, and I always use Abbey Home Farm in the Cotswolds as my sort of, that's the farm where we buy a lot of our food, and it's I think it's about 500 hectares, but it produces 156 different food products. It's got greenhouses, it's got orchards, it's got outdoor free roaming pigs. It's basically your model farm. Archie Buggles Bryce on Spain's Hall Estate is doing amazing work on this food stacking through biodiversity net gain. So creating these complex landscapes that are good for nature, which produce far more food than we're doing at the moment. Your average large cereal field produces just one product at the cost of potentially producing vast amounts of different fruit, vegetables through orchard creation. We just misuse land in the UK at an absolutely vast level. And I think, without singling out a particular sort of nation or people, if you look at Welsh hill farming, 80% of Wales is covered in pasture farming, predominantly sheep. There's not much in the way of cattle these days. And lamb constitutes less than 1% of British diet. So if you think about the ratio of the amount of land used to what we eat, the reality is that if all sheep farming in Wales stopped tomorrow, there would be no impact at all on the human diet, but there would be a great impact on communities, on social cohesion. People may have to move to the cities, and there'd be all sorts of other undesirable outcomes of that, which I wouldn't want to see. My ancestors on my mother's side are Pembrokeshire potato farmers. So I have a huge empathy for the upland farmer. It's not a fun time to be an upland farmer at all. I think James Rebanks has done amazing work highlighting this, but that's a kind of cultural social issue. But in terms of food production, we could take all of the grade 4 and the grade 5 land into ecosystem restoration or into extensive orchards, wood pasture, silvopasture, other more productive habitats where we stack different food types in the same place. vegetable production is woefully undercatered for, and fruit production, we could have a healthier diet and we could still rewild vast areas of Britain with no impact at all on the food supply. But I think we need to break down what is food, what do we actually want going into us, what is good for our guts, for our brains. Let's grow more of that. And isn't it insane that we bring most of our apples from South Africa and New Zealand when traditionally Devon, Somerset, Herefordshire, Worcestershire, Gloucestershire were powerhouses of fruit production, covered mile after mile in traditional orchards, which also had wrynecks, Bechstein's bats, lesser-spotted woodpeckers, badgers. All of these animals are able to live in these habitats. And that's the problem with intensive farming. Nature hates it, and it can't live in these vast sprayed fields that we've created. So, yeah, I'm a huge fan of food production. I just want to actually see it done properly.
Yeah, this is why I use the term or the word mess at the start, because as you started to unpack some of the things there, you realize just how complex the mess is that we've got ourselves into. It's not just diets, it's the inefficiency of everything, but also I was probably naive when I started working in this area that I thought as soon as you could explain the economic argument, or then you would suddenly have all farmers in the country converted overnight. And I guess you tapped into it there a little bit in terms of some of the cultural barriers that are still there. I mean, do you see that changing through your work? Do you think those narratives are starting to change within the farming community? And also kind of, I feel it is some of these it doesn't make sense if I think from a business like a management consultant went into the farming sector and they saw all the inefficiencies, they would be like, I don't understand it. But when you get in there and you realize that it's more around ways of life and the fact that it's far a lot of farmers find it hard to actually snap out of the cycle. I've heard this terminology before, particularly for sheep farmers, is that when you finish one job, you're on to the next. And even though you're making a loss every year, actually getting out of the cycle that you've always been in, and your grandparents were in, and their grandparents beyond that. So yeah, do you see that changing, and do you still think we've got a way to go?
I mean, my confirmation bias is that Restore inevitably attracts and is drawn to the estates and the farm that are on the point of change. And we do also have a little bit of a spatial bias, because not through any sort of elitist sense, but because we believe that nature needs really areas of, and it doesn't need to be rewilded nature. What I mean is, whether that's nature-friendly farming for cuckoos or whether that's rewilding, needs really over 1,000 acres of land. So there is a sort of confirmation bias in what I'm about to say. But I see massive change very quickly in areas where even on paper, in public, we're hearing this narrative that driven grouse is brilliant for conservation, it makes lots of money, but privately I won't mention which estates, but we're talking to various estates where they can already see they're going to make a lot more from natural capital. Young people, according to one of my clients the other day, see grouse shooting as pale, male, and stale, unquote. So the cultural shift, I think, is quite rapid. I found in Northumberland, though, was somebody once said to me, well, we're sheep farmers. What the hell else are we going to do?
Yeah.
We follow your plan, Ben, and we basically take the sheep off the hills and switch to cattle. So, of course, the initial response would be, well, you farm cattle instead. But that for a true Northumberland sheep farmer, it's sheep farm is like one word. It's not like we farm sheep, but we could do something else. It's like that is what we do. So, there's undeniably there are places where you just reach a certain point and you may not be able to proceed further. Then you end up having to do rather disingenuous things like sort of say, oh, don't worry, we can combine upland sheep grazing on the hills with ecological recovery, but you can't really. You can, move sheep off hills into the lowland areas where they actually do better and allow the hills to recover. So there are, we're always looking to find these kind of pragmatic intermediary solutions, but there comes a point where you're like, well, what we're basically saying is we want business as usual. And, my company doesn't do business as usual. So I think there are certain areas, I would say probably there are geographical hotspots of resistance to change. But I also think if you're a tenant, you're in a very difficult. Sorry,
Mm.
if you're a tenant, you're in a very different position to a landowner,
Hmm.
because a landowner can access finance in a
Yeah.
way that normally a tenant can't. Now, if I was a landowner, the first thing I would do is probably cut my tenants' rents in exchange for not farming to the edge,
Mm.
and say, well, I've got all this biodiversity net gain money coming in. Would you like to do a profit share in this? But you also have to stop using, glyphosate or whatever is going on. So I think, huge areas of the UK land are tenanted, and I think businesses have focused, probably with sensible reasons, on land farmed in hand,
Hmm.
estates, larger farms, but creating financial solutions for tenants is more difficult. And therefore, you will often find, or we often find on average, if we take on a large farmed estate, the in-hand areas, we vector in the finance very quickly. You'll find that any sort of cultural attachment to spraying or glyphosate goes out the window. As soon as the bottom line is looking good on the side of nature, we find farm managers to be, incredibly adaptable. And suddenly they're boasting to me on WhatsApp about how their turtle dove pond is better than the turtle dove pond on the neighbouring farm, which is great fun. Every farmer loves to be a little bit competitive with their neighbours in the
Hmm.
experience, but tenants, smaller farms, if you own 50 acres on Bodmin Moor, for example, or even 200 acres of upland Wales with no B&G, rubbish government payments, how do you access this financial drive for change? And the problem is, at the moment, often you don't, or it's tortuously difficult. So what
Hmm.
do you do? You're just going to keep on getting your sheep farming subsidy, because even if it's a subsidy, you know that you can make it work. You can stay on the land and you can survive. Sheep farming isn't about making money, it's about survival.
Hmm.
So I think we, all of us, restore all of our community in which we work. We need to get much better at looking at, yes, it's at the moment we are, we're doing extremely well in England, because the economy allows us to do extremely well in England. We have too many clients at the moment, as in, by which I mean we have to press pause on engagements.
Yeah.
But in Wales we have two clients, and really a lot of the finance for that is going to be philanthropic. It's going to be
Hmm.
that our client deeply cares about, excuse me, a lot of the funding in Wales is going to be philanthropic. Our
Hmm.
deeply care. They've purchased an amazing bit of Atlantic rainforest, and they're very happy to sink their own capital into, further restoring that landscape, which is very commendable. And I would never say that it shouldn't be evolved for philanthropy. But
Yeah.
what we need is a more replicable model. Like, if your Welsh sheep farmer wants to go to silvopasture orchards, cattle grazing, resting the hills, then package B has to be on the table. Package A is what they're doing at the moment. Package B has to be on the table now, and it has to be better, or they
Hmm.
won't. So that, in England, it's very different. At a large farm and estate, I can probably even, well, we can take arable production and we can replace it with extensive grazing and wood pasture, and we can make more money and create more stability and take all the costs of the inputs out, which often pushes even a big, apparently wealthy farm into the red.
Yeah.
Is the cost of inputs, the glyphosate, the fungicide, the tractors, the grain silos, all of this kind of shit, if you excuse my language, that goes fighting nature. But it is different in Wales, and it is also frustrating in Scotland as well, actually.
Mm.
Government payments in Scotland are not exciting. Of course, there isn't a live B&G market in Scotland, and there is a very unregulated and chaotic fledgling carbon market, which can occasionally be utilised for positive change, but it's a very long way off where it should be, given that we all, hope Scotland will become, in inverted commas, a rewilding nation. Obviously, vast opportunities to restore nature in Scotland, but the economy really needs to keep up with that.
Mm.
So all sorts of challenges. Of course, we've still managed to get over 70,000 acres of projects, and we hope to expand to 100,000 acres in the next few months. But it still isn't as scalable as I would like it to be.
Yeah, agreed. There's still a way to go, but it is changing quickly, and I think this term that you blended finance, as you mentioned, kind of stacking different payments, and soon you can easily make most land holdings add up, and that cost of inputs as well. Once you take that away, it can be quite staggering that just making thing tampering with it less and just using less inputs can make a huge difference to a business, which is exciting to me because sometimes people think that we need this vast influx of private capital to make it all make sense, but actually you can do a lot without that, and that on top will just be a bonus. I mean, we're hearing, just to kind of round off this point, this section, we're hearing a lot of talk about more finance potentially coming into the sector from private sources. What do you think are the main potential challenges to that, and making sure that it gets to the right places? I mean, you mentioned briefly the carbon markets as one potential source, and how you've got a little bit of skepticism, and I think I'll share that skepticism with you. Is it always going to be a case that we're piecing bits and bobs of things together, or do you hope eventually that the public goods that we've had for free, or businesses have had for free from nature for so long, will eventually be something that's kind of wrapped up in a more holistic way and paid for, as any other service would be?
Yeah, I think at the moment, I think at the moment for us to get a single actual carbon deal over the line, by which I mean both short and long-term capital to the landowner to create woodland or wooded environments, is, tortuously complex. And it is like trying to, piece together a caravan with a trailer, with a lorry, it's a very, it's a very cumbersome process. And we can make it work, and we do make it work. But my God, is it, the most inefficient sort of chaotic and in many ways sort of unregulated, where someone can just stick their finger in the air and go, well, I think carbon's worth this, 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 this. I speak quite a lot to Richard Stockdale at Oxygen, and he's on inspiring work trying to drive up the price of carbon, but more pertinently, what we're all trying to do, and on the restore side as well, particularly with our Isle of Tavensay project, carbon is a byproduct of something that can be good ecosystem restoration.
Yeah.
Carbon can also be sequestered by covering an entire landscape in Sitka spruce. Technically, we could actually cut down the oak pastures of the New Forest and replace them with Sitka. You'd probably be soaking up more carbon, but in a very limited WCC, Woodland Carbon Code sort of way. So I guess what interests me enormously is creating a premium wildland carbon market for the UK. So at the moment, we've got this disparity between carbon's worth a certain amount in the UK. A lot of the really big investors, well, if they can offset it into some possibly fictional mangrove plantation in Eritrea, then it allows them a way out.
Yeah.
So it's very important that we sift just sticking a load of trees in the ground like Brewdog did, covered in plastic tubes, or commercial forestry, which we do have a role for. But, a Sitka spruce plantation is there to produce timber. It's not there to produce biodiversity. So what we need is a premium woodland carbon market in the UK that recognises that if, for example, we wild the Isle of Tavensay, which is 4,000 acres of uninhabited Hebridean island, it will transform into a rich blend of dwarf willow and birch, and it'll be sequestering carbon in all sorts of ways. That, the soil, the maca grassland, the trees will all be conspiring to sequester a lot more carbon than the sheep grazed heather that's there at the moment. But according to official generic carbon metrics, those trees are not going to grow particularly tall. They're not going to have a very thick stem diameter, so they're not going to sequester that much carbon. So then a big organization, whether that's Aberdeen or Aviva, may want to offset into somewhere that just soaks up lots and lots and lots of carbon, which is what makes the carbon market very perverse. So I think we need a biodiversity market with carbon, which is what our colleagues at Replanet are working towards. Is seeing carbon as simply can only attain a high price if it is the byproduct of a replete living ecosystem, not a set of serried trees in stupid plastic tubes with a ridiculous carbon footprint. So, that's what we'd like to work towards. We work with organizations like Wilder Carbon. Obviously, we're talking to our partners, people like Oxygen Conservation, but it feels a long way off. Whereas actually biodiversity net gain for us has gone from being a sort of a theoretical model to something where we can make our, landowning projects 1.5 to 2 million pounds quite quickly. So unsurprisingly, at the moment, my staffing gravitates towards, biodiversity net gain specialists rather than carbon specialists. But then, of course, if we don't do the R&D on carbon, it will never become what we want it to become. It should be an amazing force for good, funding hundreds of thousands of acres of woodland regeneration, particularly in Scotland. And it can just about do that sometimes. But yeah, my goodness, is it clunky and full of sharks at the moment. Not my favorite marketplace.
No, me neither. And I think that's the issue, is that we want these things to be global because we see that as there'll be more capital coming in and things will change quicker. But actually, my experience is you end up with a lot more complexity and a lot more issues as soon as you start talking about these things on a global scale, which actually biodiversity, because it is more local in its nature, actually gives you an advantage, I think, of starting with more local policies like biodiversity net gain and then building out from there. You don't end up with all the issues of which we've got in now. I guess we are a globalized world, but when talking about carbon, you mentioned the mangrove project there. A company can pick up a project over there, or they can pick a project here, and it suddenly gets really complex, and lots of issues start to arise. I guess with all this, it's like you mentioned planting, trying to hack our way to a solution. The reality is we always end up at this point of restoring nature in the best way we can to how it wants to be and how it wants to act naturally is the best solution. We'll get there eventually, and we'll think we made all these mistakes and it took us a long time to get there, and we tried to cut corners and come up with engineered solutions to store carbon or whatever it might be. But the reality was that nature always knew the best way to get there in the end, right? So
my recipe for storing carbon in Scotland is extremely simple. Shoot all deer for 7 years.
There you go. Yeah. Easy. Yeah.
No, genuinely. I mean, it's quite interesting when you drive from Inverness to Ullapool. You'll pass lots of areas where deer have been fenced out of the landscape, and you get seasonality, which has been missing for thousands of years, hundreds of years, because you can see the birch, aspen, all of these trees. The tree seed remains in the ground far longer than floral seed. So in many cases, simply by excluding deer, but you can only really deer fence, at best, maybe 1,000 acres if you've got the cash, but normally much, much smaller areas. And even on the west coast, where you deer fence areas, funnily enough, you get this amazing emerald mass of willow. And I went to a place called Hander Island, and just south of there's a deer exclosure. And literally, it's like a different world. You've got yellowhammer, grasshopper warbler, all of these birds you wouldn't really associate with the far northwest of Scotland. But of course, that is what the landscape would look like. One, if we had wolves, and you would really need wolves, they do have an extraordinary ecosystem effect. Or two, there is a vast effort to control and lower deer numbers exponentially across huge areas, which I think we're beginning to see. Now, just by doing that, you'll look after your carbon sequestration. The trees, funnily enough, will grow themselves as they've been doing for millions and millions of years. In many cases, planting won't even be needed at all, just patience. And I think that's the other thing with markets is, generally speaking, markets are impatient.
Yep.
At Restore, we're quite lucky. All our investors are locked in for 10 years because they understand that's the time our company will take to really prosper. But really, when you're talking about carbon, you really need deals that are locked in for 50 years, because for the first 6 years after deer management, it doesn't look like anything's happened. And then normally in year 6-ish, like in Glenfeshie, like in Glentromie, the trees magically pop up out of the ground. So we need to have the timescales to realize carbon uplift following intervention. So intervention in that case being deer management, which I think is why biodiversity net gain is actually quite interesting. It's more interesting to me than countryside stewardship. It's frustrating you can only use it in such small areas, but it's beginning to recognize the timescales of nature recovery, 30 years, 50 years, not a CS scheme of 5 years, then you put your hedgerow into another CS scheme that makes you get rid of all the ecological benefits of that hedgerow by giving it a haircut because someone in DEFRA has changed the scheme, which is how we've been running the countryside, for the last 50 years, is these ridiculous gardening payments. So yeah, I think carbon will get there, but I think actually, even as a sort of free market man, having a regulated, highly nuanced and calibrated carbon market where every site is inspected and it should be naturally regenerating if possible, native trees, no tree guards, a robust steer management policy, and a higher price attached to regenerating, Caledonian woodland, Atlantic rainforest, Hebridean rainforest, which hasn't been seen in probably 4,000 years. That's what interests me. It's let's drive the carbon price up, but in accordance to amazing ecological restoration projects, not just shoving a load of trees in the ground next to the A14. Otherwise, there's no differentiation between what is good and what is shit.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real problem.
Yeah, I think I do have hope. At least carbon is becoming a more common language for business, and therefore it seems like an easier way in than potentially trying to convince businesses that they have material reliance on biodiversity and nature. And that's something that I'm trying to tackle at the moment and the industry is trying to tackle, is trying to explain to businesses that they without these ecosystem services that nature provides, there's huge risks on their balance sheet. And I don't know if these are the things you're thinking about as well. And without getting too far down the rabbit hole, I guess with it, it's biodiversity net gain in England has been, so for those who don't know, policy that's come in and it's legislated to all developers that are building housing developments or infrastructure developments, that they will have to leave nature in a better state than they found it by avoiding, mitigating, and then replacing what they can't, and then doing that for, as Benedict said, for a minimum of 30 years. So bringing in this element of a longer time scale. And what it's done is it started things moving, and it has shown that potentially the stick is more useful than the carrot for getting things moving in this area. But we're still left outside of that with operating in mostly a voluntary context when it comes to business. So how much do you think that needs to change in terms of more regulation to get things moving quicker? Or do you think we can create a better narrative for business that it's worth their while to be paying for these ecosystem services? It's worth their while to be paying for biodiversity beyond just quick, fast carbon sequestration. Do you think we can tell that story adequately to business to allow them to pay into it voluntarily? Or do you think it's always going to require regulation to get things moving?
I think we probably need both. I mean, if you look at the success, and it is a success, biodiversity net gain. When I say it's a success, I can bring in, 1.5 to 3 million pounds into a project within 18 months with one of my landowners, and we would take a very small cut of that, but they would take the vast majority. That for me is a success because the capital buys out the extractive system and it brings in the sustainable system. Now, biodiversity net gain is an interesting fusion of carrot and stick. Because the stick is, if we said to developers, you can just build everywhere and there's no offset, they'd be like, oh, great, fantastic. But we've said to developers, you have to offset. We haven't said, would you like to offset if we ask you really nicely? And that has created the ability to offset biodiversity net gain off-site, namely into projects like the Purple Plain and other projects we run across England. So, but then there is also a entrepreneurial sort of voluntary positive side to the biodiversity net gain, which is us saying to landowners, how do you want to make use of this capital? Us choosing the partners, us creating the deal that's best for us, best for the landowner. And then, spreading the capital from the biodiversity net gain into that wider project landscape. So that's an interesting fusion. So I think, to answer your question, do we need some stick? Yes, because effectively what's happening is the developers are being told, not asked, that they need to offset. At the same time, though, I think the vast majority of businesses cannot survive without nature. And we are beginning to see voluntary offsets that are so frequent, they're almost becoming a kind of benevolent corporate peer pressure. So I think there will come a time when large organizations who do not offset meaningfully, and I have some slight issues with the word offset, actually invest directly into biodiversity, will be seen as pretty old hat. And eventually it's the tobacco industry is seen now. So I think voluntary, yes, it is voluntary. And I think, there is a thriving market in voluntary offsetting. It's not as if at the top of the egg timer, I have a shortage of companies wanting to offset. It's there's the middle of the egg timer is the problem. That's the getting from the vast amounts of money in the offsetting space through to the Isle of Tarrant at the bottom via market forces, via deal making, via recognition of which carbon standard are we going to pick? How do we baseline always comes up. So I don't think there's a shortage of voluntary players, and I think therefore that's proof that actually, yes, businesses are beginning to realize, partly people like you and I making the case, but I think they're also realizing themselves that they need to be participating in creating biodiversity. And I also think a lot of businesses rely on primary materials, so timber, for example. So funnily enough, although we may not have a thriving biodiversity sector yet, we do have a thriving, fairly sustainable timber business in the UK, into which you can build a huge amount of biodiversity. So I think businesses are beginning to realize that they sort of have to invest in obviously there are bad players and there are industries that will greenwash to the cows come home. But I do think when I look at the amount of investment coming in, we're not short of investment. It's just translating the wish to invest into these rewilding projects and estates and making it more scalable. So instead of every time we work with a Scottish landowner, we have to scurry away for 18 months and create a new deal and bring all these different pieces together, it would be nice for the process to become more streamlined, I think.
I agree. I think just listening to you speaking there, I had a bit of a moment thinking we have actually come quite far in terms of the whole battle not even that long ago was worrying, would we be able to convince enough landowners to come on this journey? And it feels like we're definitely getting there on that. And then actually making the financial story more coherent and bringing in more finance is not the easy part, but it's the next part of the journey. And I think it's easy to forget how far we've come in terms of having the amount of projects coming forward and the amount of really exciting projects coming forward that you get. You can forget that that moment there. I realized actually we should reflect on that. And in terms of your projects you're working on at Restore, I mean, are there any ones in particular that you have in the pipeline at the moment that you're happy to share that are really exciting you and getting you out of bed in the morning at the moment?
Well, I'll probably focus on the one that's both the most exciting and the most frustrating.
Right.
We will solve the frustration. So we're very fortunate to be working with the Kelleher family who own the island of Tarrant on the Hebrides. So obviously they're in Scotland. There's no biodiversity net gain. There's no real government payment for ecosystem restoration, which is fairly extraordinary oversight on the part of Scottish government. So we're working with them to finance this project alongside a number of other stakeholders. And you would have thought that creating 4,000 acres of Atlantic rainforest in a completely genuine closed system, which has not happened anywhere in the UK ever, would be the easiest project for somebody like, Restore, the landowners working in partnership to achieve. But actually, it's extraordinary how many gaps appear when you take on a project like this. So, as I said earlier on, the perversities of carbon, the fact the trees aren't going to grow, they're not going to shoot up, they're not going to instantly sequester carbon, is a frustration. So at the moment, we're still quite optimistic about the biodiversity credits element to this. So prioritizing a fusion of biodiversity uplift alongside carbon. there's a lot of discussions about, what the value of those units should be, what market is best suited to a Hebridean Atlantic rainforest regeneration scheme of 4,000 acres, because there hasn't been one before. So
Exactly. Yeah.
there's no precedent. We can't use precedents from other countries. They're completely irrelevant. And it is a completely unique system. The trees will grow very differently to trees that we have seen growing in this country for a very long time, and it will be an extraordinary landscape. And but yeah, the project is in need of well over £3 million of capital to really initiate. Followed then, of course, by becoming a self-sustaining ecotourism enterprise that employs local people. So it's a project I've actually been working on long before the formation of a store.
Mm.
It's a project I've actually been working on long since the formation of the store, since 2019, in fact, and still the finance remains elusive. But we are closing in on it finally, we believe. But yes, a shout out to any investors who want to participate in the restoration of 4,000 acres of Atlantic rainforest on a remote, uninhabited island in the Hebrides, formerly known as being the home of castaways. Please get in touch.
It's like, yeah, it sounds like a really exciting project, and yeah, it's just figuring out that final piece of the puzzle. We've got the projects there, yeah, just bringing in that finance to make it a reality, which feels just within grasp now more and more, but it is just joining those final dots really. So yeah, in terms of things, that are sorry, I've just lost my place there. One sec. This is why it's good it's not live. Yeah, for I guess we're talking a lot about the countryside and about how we can do things at scale there, and that's what Restore are working on primarily, is not messing around with bits and bobs and gardening, and we're really trying to do things at landscape scale. But I know you do still advocate for what people can do themselves and what you can do within cities. I mean, we're in an increasingly urbanized country, which gives us, I guess, in some aspects more opportunities to do stuff in the countryside, but also there's going to be a need to do things within the cities themselves. And as a rewilder, I was interested to get your thoughts on what your vision for future rewilded cities might look like, and your advice to anyone listening to this who isn't an estate owner, or you're a farm owner who just has maybe a backyard in a town or city, and what they might be able to do to contribute towards this the bigger picture, I guess.
Well, the chapter I most enjoyed writing in Rebirding was the penultimate chapter called Our Birds, because I knew it would actually impact the most people, maybe not the most land by acres, but the most people reading it. Most of us, well, not most of us, but many of us are fortunate to own a garden. So I think life can be restored on every level. And just because we at Restore, work up to 13,000 acres, I still employ a lot of the techniques I've perfected in my garden.
Nice.
Because you have to be able to rebuild complex floral communities, anthills. The life is really built at the moment, certainly in the absence of major apex predators in the UK, ecosystems are restored mainly from the bottom up. Even if you scale those approaches across vast landscapes, you're still really building from the bottom up, by which I mean soil recovery, botanical recovery, and invertebrates. And you can do all of that in your garden, and it's an awful lot of fun. So I built my house in Bristol 5 years ago. There was Leylandii around the edge, and there was a lawn in the middle, and that was it. So got rid of the Leylandii and basically trowel rootled my garden. Put down some carpet. I was doing up a house at the time. Took the old carpets out, laid them on the lawn over the winter to really kill off the sort of the ryegrass, which I didn't really want. This is not very diverse. And then sort of went around with a trowel pretending to be a wild boar. Couldn't get a boar.
That's a shame.
I know, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what the residents would have
Yeah,
thought.
first day in the new house and this looking over the fence. It's I think he's got
I'm sure
a pet boar.
they were very bemused by my behaviour and probably still are. But anyway,
Yeah.
into the rootle, I then sowed all sorts of different wildflowers, put in some plugs to get different sort of variety of height straight away, and I imported from a local park. I'm fairly sure this may not be legal, but sort of various colonies of yellow meadow ants, and basically what sort of dug them into the ground, put them under nice big sandstone rocks from the bottom of the garden, and established a colony of yellow meadow ants, which act as my little micro elephants. Basically, they're
Amazing.
harvesting the grass, allowing diverse sward, earthy areas where the robins come down to feed, and green woodpeckers, of course. And allowing those flowers to get away, and then of course sowed it with yellow rattle to keep those dominant grasses on the back foot. And then around the edge, hawthorn, spindle, wild pear, crabapple, birch, all of the native trees that generate the most insects. And I managed to split this into about a 40-foot garden.
Amazing.
So in the last few years, I've had ragwort has come up, and then cinnabar moths have come in from somewhere and found the ragwort, and I've had enormous fun watching the wonderful black and yellow caterpillars nibbling away on the ragwort.
Yeah.
Wolf spiders and other predators have come in to prey on all the various insects. The other day, I had an ashy mining bee that lost a battle with a garden spider. So we've got this wonderful little mini ecosystem, and I can literally sit in my garden doing my Zoom meetings. And if one of them's a little bit boring, I can always drift off. And there's always something amazing coming in and pollinating the lesser knapweed or the wild carrot. And managed to fit in about 50, 60 different species of vascular plant. So we can squeeze life into any space, from a box to a green roof. But I mean, in terms of my inspiration for what a green city should look like, in a word, Berlin. Because Berlin is a first world city. It's part of a thriving economy. They've got beavers, boar, goshawks, eagle owls within the city. And nobody really minds. When the wild boar go through a playground, you don't see the police coming out, ready to shoot. They've created a little rest station for beavers so they can cross the river in the middle of the city. You get white-tailed eagles over the city, and there's a park near Berlin where you've got bison and redback shrikes. Like that is a higher level of life than we have in the British countryside.
I know.
In the city of Berlin, which is a first world city carrying out all the normal functions, finance, teachers, whatever, everyone just going about their daily business alongside this extraordinary abundance of biodiversity, which for me is epitomized by parkland nesting goshawks. I just think that's incredible. Goshawk, you go to Kielder Forest for New Forest. In Berlin, they're nesting in the parks. So
I love that.
there's infinite potential for sharing with nature. And actually, some of the London brownfield sites and places like Barnes Wetland Centre, are absolutely amazing living examples of that. You can go to the Barnes Wetland Centre in winter and watch a pair of peregrines cooperatively hunting shovelers against the backdrop of Tower Hamlets. And I just think that's amazing because it gives people access to nature who would never necessarily have the time or the money to go, eagle watching on the Isle of Mull and for whom the wider countryside is just eco-silence. So actually to have these brownfield reserves within our cities, on the edge of our cities, in the middle of our cities, I think is fantastic.
That's amazing. I didn't actually, despite having been to Berlin, I didn't realize quite how much nature they had there. And it shows, doesn't it, you can quite happily live and exist alongside these thriving ecosystems if they're just not seen as a pest and something to be tidied up, but something that helps us, thrive. And your garden sounds similar. I don't think mine's quite at that point yet, but it's just the joy of watching things come back to life and the noise start to increase. I dug a pond this year in my fairly small garden, and it just within a month, the amount of life that managed to figure out somehow appear from nowhere. Frogs that I don't know how they managed to find the pond within about a week just appeared. So it's fascinating how things find a way, and everyone can play their part in this story of rewilding. It's that's what's so exciting to it. And I agree, when I read your book, it was that chapter that really kind of rounded it off nicely, I think, because the word can feel quite distant to some people perhaps, but it can be something that can connect on all levels, which I really like. So, are you, before I come on to the final three questions, I mean, how are you you seem like an optimistic optimistic guy. Are you still optimistic that we're gonna turn these things around in time, and kind of what's the main stumbling block you're seeing that if you could wave a magic wand, you would change? How optimistic are you?
Well, I've always been optimistic, but I think when you run a business that is thriving with demand for nature restoration, your optimism has some founded
It
reality.
does. Yeah, yeah.
And to be honest, what I'm seeing is that what we can do at, places like Pertwood Farm or South Hill, we can do it certainly on almost any larger farm or estate in England, which is replace extractive economics with restorative economics, and rapidly working with farm managers, gamekeepers on the ground, supercharge nature restoration, whether sort of high abundance nature friendly farming or rewilding, or ideally, often in many cases, a fusion of both. And the speed has even taken me by surprise. I mean, at South Hill Estate, we've now removed in 2 years, thanks to the incredible gamekeeper we're working with there, 3,000 muntjac deer. So by default, we've seen an amazing pulse of vegetation, probably measured in the hundreds of thousands of trees, none of which we planted. So we don't need to do any tree planting on 4,000 acres of Bedfordshire, which isn't even known for its nature, let alone its nature recovery. And we're now looking at putting in beavers. This has all happened in 2 years. 2 years ago, it was a much more conventional estate, with some good nature-friendly farming measures, absolutely, and a very enlightened landowner.
Yep.
So I think we're still in the early pioneer stage, and that's fine. But I think we're seeing replicable models whereby actually every time we create a Pertwood plain project in Wiltshire, we now know that all the surrounding landowners looking over the fence go, that's interesting, because our farm may not be doing as well as we pretend it is in public. And isn't it interesting that this, very business savvy family have made a decision to switch from intensive arable to nature? They wouldn't be doing that unless there was a very strong economic reason for doing so. So that for me means we can scale this exponentially, which comes to why we don't want to own any land at Restore, because if we can just change the way people think and embed with them for 5 years, which are the transformation years, the ecologically difficult years, then there is no real limit to our portfolio size except eventually demand. But we're so far off that, my limitations are staffing based, and that's simply how you manage your cash flow and do equity basis and so on. But so no, I'm very optimistic, particularly in England, and cautiously optimistic in Scotland. And sadly, I do think the country perhaps most in need of ecological restoration of all, which is Wales, is due to government policy and a lack of access to private finance is lagging a long way behind. And that's very sad, because Wales is ideally suited to being a country of Atlantic rainforest on the hills and farming in the valleys, and a place capable of preparing us for climate change by creating the weather. And it's very sad that we collectively haven't been able to find ways to allow Welsh Hill farmers to access the finance needed to change, and that's a big problem. So we've got a lot of obstacles ahead of us, but I think it's the ready access to finance. And even though we do biodiversity net gain with our landowners, and I know you do at the Environment Bank, most landowners still remain very confused by private markets, and it hasn't been helped by some people going in and giving them very confusing deals that appear to carry all sorts of T's and C's that then landowners don't either like or understand, or both. So everything we do at Restore, we try and just simplify it so it's very clear. We take what they take, the time frame, the risks. And I mean, strangely, I've always thought we'd have more competitors. I'd almost like there to be more people doing what we were doing to really speed the process up. But no, fundamentally, I have very good reason to be optimistic, I think, at the moment. I think we're in for a big change in land use.
Agreed. I share that optimism. I'm glad to hear that you are optimistic as well, because I think that, I mean, I'm not going to get into it now. When you mentioned Wales, I was like, I could talk to you probably for hours about land use strategy and how we need one and how we need to plan that better. But I won't get into that now. We'll catch up at another time or something. But yeah, again, thanks, Benedict, for this chat. It's been really good. I've got three questions to round off, which I ask all my guests. Just a bit of fun to round off the podcast, if that's all right with you. And the first one, in the spirit of getting more people to join you and others on this entrepreneurial journey of bringing more eyes and focus into the nature space and tackling these environmental problems through innovative businesses like you're doing at Restore. I've been asking my guests if they've got any other business ideas that they've never quite been able to get to, or something that, a business they wish they could create to help them with their business alongside it. Have you got anything that you'd happily share with listeners who maybe want to start something or get moving but haven't got the idea?
The area where I think we're behind and we could catch up, but it would require major investment away from our primary business at the moment is in data, because ecological data is incredibly clunky. Most things you look at, it just completely turn you off. Landowners sort of, you give them their B&G readout and they're just like, well, look, just tell me what this means. So you can get this many units, so this much, this capital, right? Okay, let's do it. So, I've always wanted, and there's genuine shout out to anyone who can help us with this, a Restore app. At one end of the app is Restore, at the other end is the landowner. And this app has to capture an extraordinary amount of data as to how we change landscapes financially and ecologically, because the speed at which we move is pretty fast. I'm already changing landscapes ahead of necessarily having the capacity to create and share the data in a way that can then be replicated or shared with universities or visualized. The speed at which we're changing South Hill Estate, and now even from the air in a year's time, will look completely different with all the trees and the grassland coming up, the hedgerows dissolving. So the data is almost lagging behind the speed at which we're doing the finance, the vision, and the management.
Yeah.
So creating a single hub whereby all of the financial and ecological change is recorded, shared with landowners, and can also then be shared with journalists, with the public, is something I never quite have the time to work on at the moment, but it's very important.
I love that. It's a genuine shout out there for anyone that's got that. Not that. I mean, I can agree. There's so much data that extra data we can capture, data that's already being captured, but there's just not being displayed in quite the right way. And it's all about telling that story and helping to bring the public, to bring businesses along and tell the important story behind what we're doing and the impact that it's having. I mean, yeah, I completely agree. That's a really, packaging that up in a neat way that makes it easier to understand, I think would be really fascinating. So yeah, shout out to anyone out there who can do that and pull that together. The second to last question I've got is around books, and obviously as an author yourself, I'm happy for you to share, if you're one of your own books, but I will put a note to your books in the show notes anyway. But have you read anything recently? It doesn't have to be in the nature field. It can be non-fiction, fiction, but that you'd like to share with listeners that might inspire them.
Well, I think, I mean, at the moment, we're looking at the Wainwright Prize shortlist has come out, and a range of amazing books. I mean, Nature's Ghost by Sophie Yeo is superb. I suppose maybe my personal favorite, just because I've spent so much time with the animals myself, is Chantal Lyons's book, Groundbreakers, about the wild boar. And I wrote a chapter on boar in my third book, Cornerstones, about keystone species, but Chantal goes into the whole, it's everything from the psyche, people's attitudes, the animals themselves, the way they change the landscape, the cultural lack of acceptance. Because I think in Britain, we've become very good at beavers because they are cute and fun, and they create obvious ecological outcomes, but wild boar are amazingly important animals to the ecosystem. We really can't restore nature without either wild boar or a close proxy, Tamworth pigs. But it will be lovely to have the real deal in, at least in the forest, well, left alone in the forest,
Yeah,
in
yeah, yeah.
the New Forest, in Sussex Weald and Kielder and places, and the Cairngorms. So it's just a brilliant book, and anyone who really wants to understand why wild boar are so amazing and important and deserving of not just being shot and treated as a menace, Chantal's book is amazing, and I sort of hope it does win the Wainwright Prize. But it's an amazing short list of books at the moment.
Yeah, I'll have to check out the full list, but that is in my Kindle downloads already to read that book, because I agree, the boar. It's the amount of work they can do if you wander around the forest of Dean, and kind of, as you said, that could be seen by some people annoyingly as vandalism, but to me it's like, this is exactly what we need to get things moving, so we don't have to get out with a trowel. Like you said before, it's much easier to use a boar than a trowel. We need a lot of people with trowels.
You'd need thousands of trowels or a small
Yeah,
number of boar. I mean,
exactly.
I studied the impact of boar years after, and the problem with rootling is you
Mm,
can't just look at it at the time. Nature doesn't work in a 1 year time frame. It works in
no.
a 130 infinite time frame. So it's only when you go back you find the foxglove, the bramble, the white admiral butterflies,
Hmm.
spotted flycatchers. They've all been brought back in areas where the boar have been allowed to rootle and create mess.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, amazing animals.
I love them. And my final question to round us off is the billboard question, which is, if you could put a quote or message on a billboard out there, in Bristol, it can be in Bristol, it can be in a town or city nearby, that gets a message out to the general public to inspire change, inspire action. What would that quote or message be?
Well, I've been thinking about this, and I'm not necessarily the best sort of billboard answer, but I was just thinking, the phrase "don't be a bore." I just thought you could have "be a bore,"
I love that.
and you could have a lovely, great big picture of a wild boar, and then a link to a site telling you about the nature restoration that you can do from your garden to rewilding our big landscapes, all seen through sort of the prism of this animal with this enormous snout, a walking trowel, as you put it. Um, so I just thought "be a boar" might be quite fun, but
Yeah,
I'm
boy.
sure better slogans are available.
No, I like it. It would definitely make people stop and think, "What? Be a bore? Okay," and then click the link. Oh, okay, I understand. So yeah, I like it. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Well, that's been a really interesting conversation, Benedict, and yeah, thanks for coming on and sharing what you're working on. I mean, it's obviously an area that I work in quite closely as well, so I had to be careful there not to go down too many rabbit holes. Could have talked for hours about many of these things and got deep into natural capital markets and all sorts of things, but we'll save that for off air sometime. But yeah, thanks again very much for taking the time, and yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob.
So I hope you enjoyed that episode there. Thanks to everyone that's listened, to returning listeners, and to people that are new here to the podcast or on YouTube as well. As I said at the start, this is now on YouTube if you're seeing me in 3D. Please do comment, leave comments about the episode or future guests you might want to see, or if you're someone that's building a nature planet positive business, then please do reach out if you want to be on the podcast as well. We'd love to have you on. Look out on the YouTube channel for more videos that I'll be posting about the planet positive business I'm starting, and you can also follow along on the podcast, the mini series called the Startup Diaries, where me and my brother are documenting us building a planet positive fashion brand called No Longer Known. So do follow along on that. We're doing short episodes every couple of weeks as we build that business out. I'm going to carry on posting these interviews as and when I do them. I've got a few lined up, so hopefully I'll be posting those as and when, and they'll be hitting the podcast platforms and channel as I do so. And I'll be back in a week or so with another episode. So until then, see you soon.